Hello, and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm your host, Ahval editor David Lepeska, and with me today is Soli Özel, International Relations Professor at Istanbul's Kadir University. Thanks so much for joining us, Soli. Hello.
Sure, thanks.
We are talking on Tuesday, February 25th. In the past few weeks, Turkey has sent some 10,000 troops to reinforce its positions in Idlib, Syria, where a Russian-backed Syrian government offensive has killed 16 Turkish soldiers and forced close to 1 million people to flee toward the border. UN officials have in recent days talked of an unfolding humanitarian horror story in Idlib. In your column on Sunday, you compared the situation there to Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel Chronicle of a Death Foretold, in which everybody in a village knows that a certain man is going to be killed, but nobody does anything to stop it. I wonder what you think. Why has nobody done anything to stop what's happening in Idlib, and who today is best placed to come to the rescue?
Well, I guess the story of the Syrian debacle or the Syrian tragedy is one big long Marquez story, the Chronicle of a Death Foretold. One can say that unlike the story, perhaps, what one can say there was really not much we could do. I doubt that this is true, but Idlib was a disaster waiting to happen. What held it together, or what held it kind of in a very unstable stability, was the agreements between Turkey and Russia. And
the 2018
unfortunately, perhaps the Syrian government itself was not directly a party to the agreement between and Russia. Neither was Iran, by the way, which is the third partner in the Astana process. And it was just a matter of time when the Syrian regime would make its move in order to recapture some other part of its territory, which was the major territory left without that it could not control. And what Turkey was supposed to have done in the past year and a half, 16 months or so, since it signed an agreement in Sochi with Russia, was to clear the area from the most rabid jihadist elements. And Russia complained and said that Turkey did not really keep its promise. And
which is true,
Turkey,
right?
Yeah, which is true. And Turkey also accused Russia for not keeping its promises either. So the two partners, in a way, walked along this road. And as I said, we were all waiting for the Syrians to make a move. For some reason, the Turkish government either thought that move would not ever be made, or that it could actually stop it when it started. And that's what I believe we're witnessing in the past 3 weeks, that the Syrian regime is moving along. The Russians are supporting them, as they always do. The bombardment, as I understand it, is indiscriminate. About 7 or 8 Turkish observation posts are behind the lines, that is, are surrounded by the by the Syrian army, and I believe they're being protected only by the Russians. And if the Russians at one point decide not to protect them, and then these guys would be at the mercy of the Syrian army. And the Syrian army is moving along, and Turkey wishes them to go back to the status quo ante, and what wishes to prevent them from not just getting, but controlling the two main highways, M5 and M4, which would finally link all the major cities in Syria and put them under regime control. So far, Turkey failed, and the regime's advance is moving along. And as a result of the indiscriminate bombing, and also what everybody knows would await them if the Syrian regime finally gets control of all the towns in the region, people are fleeing for their lives, and they're now once more at Turkey's borders, and Turkey can no longer either afford to, nor does it want to, accommodate or welcome inside its territory any more Syrian refugees, because there is now a backlash presence.
Right. We'll get to that the refugee issue domestically for in a minute, but Turkey has given Assad until the end of February, which is just 3 more days, to pull back his forces in Idlib. Turkey has also called on the U.S. to provide Patriot missiles in support of its positions. President Trump has expressed support for Turkey, but taken no substantial action. You've talked about how growing tensions between Turkey and Russia, and it was reportedly Russian strikes that killed 2 Turkish soldiers last week, how Turkey-Russia tensions offer an opening for the United States. So I wonder why you think the United States isn't stepping in to help its NATO ally, and how do you expect all this to play out in Idlib in the coming days?
Technically, Turkey is not under attack. The operations are taking place in a third country's territory. Mm-hmm. And yes, the United States is applauding, encouraging, sympathizing, empathizing with Turkey, but it really cannot and will not do anything, because that would mean risking a war with the Russians. One always has to keep in mind that since the first day when the Russians entered the Syrian war in September of 2015, the Russians and the Americans actually made their arrangements for deconflicting. So in a very small territory such as Syria, the two sides' aircraft had never really had a reason to have a conflict. It was quite remarkable. The only conflict that happened was between American Air Force and the Russian mercenaries, and the Russians basically suggested that it was not their people, and that was the end of the story. So I don't think the Americans would get into that. And if Turkey were attacked in its own territory by the Syrian army, then of course that would be a different story. I don't think the Syrian army is going to do that. The Russians are not going to start bombarding inside Turkey. Moreover, I don't think the Russians want to break relations with Turkey. They're just basically showing Turkey what its limits are in determining what's going to happen on the territory. So I guess this is basically the framework within which the next steps are going to take place. As for the initial point you made, President Erdogan said that unless by the end of the month the Syrian army withdrew to its lines before the recent conflict started, I really don't think Turkey is in a position to actually do much about that.
So you don't. So if Assad forces do not pull back, if they continue their advance, you don't think Turkey will launch this threatened all-out assault, even though they have, reinforced their position with many.
I am not well versed on military matters, but I suspect that it would be almost impossible to be effective unless you have air cover in such an assault. And we know that the Russians control the airspace. To the best of my knowledge, not until we speak now, did the Russians say, okay, of course you can use the airspace in order to facilitate your ground attack against my protege, my ally, my friend, Bashar al-Assad's forces.
Tomorrow, Wednesday, Turkey and Russia are set to again discuss a possible ceasefire in Idlib after 2 previous attempts failed. Also, leaders of Turkey, Russia, Germany, and France are set to meet next week to discuss Idlib. I wonder if you see that summit leading to some sort of agreement. I mean, especially because the involvement of EU leaders who might be able to make some commitments to Erdogan regarding refugees seems like a possible key.
I quite frankly, unless the Syrian army is done with what it's supposed to be doing, what they were actually intent on doing, I don't think much is going to come out of the Russia-Turkey summit of tomorrow. I'm more hopeful about the summit on the 5th, because I think by then the Syrian army will probably have gained whatever it wanted to gain. And then the 4 parties can sit down, can come up with a plan that will give Turkey a face saving out as well, I think. And I believe Mrs. Merkel's visit in Turkey nearly a month ago was about keeping the refugees on the Syrian side of the border, and then Germany financing the construction of tenements so that these people would not be uh, living outside without a roof over their head, or without a tent or anything, any such thing. So the four-way summit may be the ticket out of the current situation. What will happen next, I really don't know. One should also probably look at the direction where the Syrian military is pushing the refugees. To the best of my understanding, they're pushing them more and more towards the town of this city of Hatay, and that's where they're concentrating. It's a place where there is a lot of refugees already, and where tensions have been heightened in the past few months as well.
Right. As you say, Idlib is Syria's last rebel-held province, and it's now hosting some 3 million displaced people from all over Syria, driven there by previous offensives in other provinces. Last October, you said Europe is scared stiff of another wave of refugees, but so too,
Yeah.
of course, is Erdogan, who fears that if Turkey takes in another 1 or 2 million refugees, he could lose the next election. It's become such a tense issue.
Yeah.
So let's say some sort of agreement is reached in Idlib that enables Assad to retake all or nearly all of the province and forces the displaced into Turkey. How do you see that playing out? Would Turkey allow them to pass through to Europe? Might Erdogan succeed with this plan to resettle 1 million or more refugees in northeast Syria?
I I don't see the Syrian regime pushing them across the border. I mean, if Turkey doesn't open the border, I don't know how they're going to enter the country. Yes, there will be a lot of pressure and pictures, humanitarian disaster. I'm sure a lot of newspaper people and then talking heads are going to criticize Turkey for not opening its borders. But quite frankly, the Europeans have really nothing to say to Turkey on this issue, on this matter. My sense is, yes, Turkey will try to contain them in whatever sliver of territory there is between the territories occupied by or territories controlled by the Syrian military and the border. Whether that would be a large enough spot to accommodate 900,000 and even more people, I really do not know. But again, I think the Germans have committed themselves to helping build accommodations for these people, and that's what I expect to come out of the summit on the 5th. And perhaps, if you're very optimistic, maybe a plan or a roadmap is going to come out of that summit that might lead us back to Geneva. And there you will have other issues that the Turks will have to discuss with the Russians and everybody else.
Wow, so you see Germany helping Turkey build some settlement areas for refugees within Syrian borders.
Yeah,
What sort of assistance? Do you mean funding? Do you mean something else?
probably funding.
Hmm.
Mainly funding. Mainly funding. I think Turkey is probably capable of building buildings, and there's nothing that the government would like more than the ability to get back its contractors at work. And that would be a solution that will at least temporarily solve everybody's problems. Europe doesn't want any more refugees. Turkey doesn't want any more refugees. Turkey's contractors need jobs, businesses to start building, and the Germans appear to be willing to pay up for that, so that they will not have to deal with another refugee wave in Europe.
Now to Libya, if we could. Turkey has been backing the Tripoli-based UN-recognized Government of National Accord, or GNA, for a few years, and has stepped up that support in recent weeks by dispatching as many as 6,000 Syrian rebels to fight for the GNA.
Yeah.
Last week, the EU agreed to launch a new naval and air mission to enforce the UN arms embargo in Libya, which could make it harder for Turkey to support the GNA. The Turkish government has of late been keeping a lid on news about its intervention, and just last week hacked the email and social media accounts of 2 journalists who had publicly discussed the deaths of Turkish
Yeah.
soldiers. I wonder why you think Ankara has made what seems to be a striking shift from approving an intervention in parliament and Erdogan talking it up and leaking info about sending thousands of rebels to back the GNA to now revealing only minor details about its operations and silencing any public talk about Libya.
Because As far as the Turkish public is concerned, Libya is not something that would pay up politically, domestically. I don't think there is much support, if any, for a Libya intervention inside the country. Eh, but it started. It cannot be stopped, I suppose. So better to keep things quiet, and particularly keep things quiet if there are casualties in Libya, because this is really not something that touches the country at all. At
Hmm.
all. I
Hmm.
mean, even Idlib is not touching the country the way Operation Peace Spring did, because Peace Spring was sold fundamentally for two reasons. One, that it was an attack against the PKK, and once you say the PKK, you do get public support.
Hmm.
And second, there was also, remember, the promise that if Turkey managed to actually control the entire zone that it wanted to control, that we would be, or Turkey would be able to send 2 million refugees back to Syria. And that was music on both counts. This
Hmm.
was music to the ears of the public. In Idlib, you're trying to prevent another wave of refugees, let alone creating space so that you can send back some of the Syrians who are already in Turkey, and Libya is just too remote. And no amount of Atatürk fought there. It used to be Ottoman Empire. Now we have this agreement about the exclusive economic zones. I really don't think this will resonate with the larger public.
What is your sense of how many Turkish soldiers are there and what are they doing? The government says that it's mainly advisors, but then there seems to be reports of more than just advisors, Turkish soldiers actually fighting there. What is your sense of Turkey's actual military commitment in Libya at the moment?
I really don't know. I really don't know. So I'd better not speak. I haven't followed it.
Right.
And by the way, I mean, you really have to dig very hard to figure out what's happening, exactly what had happened, and I haven't.
Right. They seem to be kind of covering up what is actually happening
Well,
to
you
our.
said it in your initial question that the quieter the better is the motto, and unless you're specialized in such matters and you know exactly the troop movements and stuff, you could somebody who does that could probably answer, I haven't and I won't.
And not just in Syria and Libya, but also in the Eastern Mediterranean and in relations with the United States and NATO. Turkey has been considerably more assertive, even combative in the past year or two, from
Yeah.
purchasing Russian S-400 missile defenses to sending drill ships to waters claimed by Cyprus. What do you see as the main reason behind this sort of foreign policy? Is it a sign of desperation on the part of Erdogan? Is it part of a more independent neo-Ottoman regional strategy? Are there other factors at play here?
Um, I think one, in answering this particular question about Eastern Mediterranean, one has to separate two things. One is whether or not one likes the style with which the foreign policy is being conducted, and whether or not one agrees with whatever ideological uh, aspiration or inspiration might be behind that particular policy. And the other one, which I think is far more important, is what the general context. And the general context is everybody is behaving as if Turkey doesn't really have any interests and rights in Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, the Cyprus issue is unresolved not because of Turkey. The Cyprus issue is unresolved because of the Europeans in particular. The Europeans basically thought that the Cyprus issue, which remained dormant I mean, unresolved, didn't really create any problems, could actually continue to remain unresolved forever. And that was also a very good excuse to keep Turkey uh, from acceding into the European Union. By the way, that order also has gone by the wayside. We no longer talk about it. It's not realistic. But now that the energy resources have been found there and everybody is interested in getting a piece of it, then suddenly, of course, Cyprus becomes very important, and the unresolution of the Cyprus problem is behind the conflicts that Turkey has now with everyone. Plus, I mean, you cannot really have. I mean, Turkey has bad relations with both Egypt and Israel, and the Greeks and the Greek Cypriots have invested heavily in creating much better ties than historically they had with Israel. So the four parties are keep on meeting and signing agreements and deciding that they will use that route through Greece to send the gas to Europe, which was very expensive. Probably it will not be done. And Turkey feels encircled. Turkey feels isolated and contained to its beaches. It will not accept that. And I honestly, especially from France, the language is unacceptably rude. And Turkey responds in kind. As I said, I think in the general context, there's got to be a major settlement of the Cyprus issue, and the Greek Cypriots will have to recognize the rights of the Turkish Cypriots and all of those things that we haven't been able to resolve for the last 45 years, and then we can move on. Because everybody tries to play hardball, it is the situation appears very tense, and accidents can always happen. Turkey sends ships in order to explore energy sources here and there in the Mediterranean. ExxonMobil sends theirs, while ExxonMobil cooperates with Qatar, which is supposed to be Turkey's ally. It's a total mess. So unless cooler heads prevail and we actually sit down and discuss the general framework within which all those things are happening, this will be an accident-prone region, and God knows we don't really need a conflict, an armed conflict in particular, in this part of the world and in this part of the Mediterranean.
It sounds like you think that Turkey's recent policies, at least in the Eastern Mediterranean, are an understandable or reasonable response to the realities on the ground, rather than the sign of some internal domestic shift in policy position.
No, I think the general context is we will not be allowing you to actually imprison us to our beaches. As I said, how the policy is conducted, whether or not the way you actually communicate your reactions is the right way of doing it, those are different matters. I don't particularly think diplomatically the Turkish government followed the right path, but in the general context, I do think Turkey's rights, some of Turkey's positions ought to be recognized as right, and everybody ought to get back to their senses and try to solve the Cyprus issue.
Mm-hmm. Next month marks 17 years in power for Erdogan, the longest of any leader in Turkey's history. Many have pointed out his significant achievements, like vastly increased prosperity, improved transportation, infrastructure, a major military buildup. But most also see these achievements as potentially undermined by problematic economic policies and a dismantling of the rule of law. Just last week came what many see as the cherry on top, the rearrest of Osman Kavala for involvement in the 2016 failed coup, hours after he and 8 others had been acquitted in charges linked to the Gezi protests. Observers like Murat Yetkin argued that this showed how Erdogan sees Kavala as the embodiment of everything he stands against. What did Kavala's acquittal and rearrest mean to you in terms of the state of Turkish democracy under Erdogan?
It speaks volumes about the state of Turkish judiciary. And of course, then by extension, it says volumes again, about the state of Turkish democracy. It was really painful to watch that thing unfold, from the heights of joy to the depths of, I don't know what, anxiety, anger, sadness, and whatever. This is the picture in the country today. A lot of people are unhappy about it. They speak up, but plenty of other people don't care. I think it's a Pew poll that suggests that 40% of Turks would be very happy with an authoritarian system. But nonetheless, this is a country which always has taken at least the electoral process very seriously. It has shown how seriously it took the electoral process and actually delivered a verdict in the municipal elections. For the moment, this is the one thread we have to hang on to, and firmly, until the next chance we have to vote. Other than that, some very weak signs that within the judiciary there are also elements that are unhappy with the way things look. That is, the judiciary appearing to be an extension of the executive branch, and there are just far too many examples of that around. But the Constitutional Court on certain matters has begun reasserting some degree of autonomy or independence. There are certain courts that actually do the same. And this is not enough to clear the picture, but that suggests that at least it's not as blanket. It's not as dark as it was, let's say, 2 years ago. Small hope, over optimism, perhaps, but this is the play we have for the moment. And I certainly hope with all my heart that Osman Kavala will be released from the absurd accusation of being the participant or an organizer of the 15th of July coup.
Right. You say it's a little bit brighter today than 2 years ago. Last April,
brighter may not be the right word.
Well, let me ask this question.
Glimmers of hope, yes.
Last April, you wrote that Turkey's local elections marked a game changer. Since then, we've seen İmamoğlu take Istanbul by a much larger margin. Yeah. Dozens more mayors for the pro-Kurdish HDP dismissed, and a splintering of the AKP with these new parties forming. So it seems like you were right, that was a game changer, I think. How do you expect all this to keep playing out in the coming year? Many have talked of early elections, but to me that doesn't seem likely.
Again, maybe one should separate two things. One is the situation, in my judgment, in general, is untenable. We don't have an economic policy. Our foreign policy is at best in disarray. Professionals, competent people are not in positions of directing any policy. We don't really hear or read much about it, but I think the responses to disasters happening around the country leave a lot to be desired. And as you've suggested, even in terms of the respecting the outcomes of elections, what is happening with HDP mayors is threatening, or is threatening the integrity of the process and the integrity of the sanctity of the vote. On the other hand, yes, we have not just in Istanbul, but in Ankara and in Turkey's other major cities, mayors that represent from the opposition. They are being squeezed in terms of how they can actually run their cities. Most of them have inherited cities that were indebted up to their nose, and the government is trying to actually cut off their sources of income. So this is a struggle, and this is, in my judgment, this is an inherently untenable situation. Therefore, even though I don't see what the mechanics of an early election is going to be, I see the situation as untenable, and I expect that the mechanics of an early election will probably make their appearance at some point. Otherwise, crisis is going to be the normal state of things, and we will have a population that is increasingly angry, despondent. Those who can exit will exit, and others are going to try to find ways of actually getting by. And the polarization might increase, and as I said, anger would increase, and sooner or later this will put pressure on the political system. And you mentioned the two defecting figures, one of whom has formed a party. They seem to be doing fine in terms of actually opening up branches throughout the country.
Davutoglu's future party.
Davutoglu's party. And the other one, Babacan, I don't know what they're doing, quite frankly, because they have postponed their announcement for forming the party several times already. And they probably, if they had any momentum, they might actually be losing the momentum. But let's say they also come out and finally form their party. You will have a significant bloc, whether or not, and the question is going to be whether or not this bloc, with the addition of two more parties, will be able to actually act in a coordinated fashion the way they did, minus the two new parties, during the municipal elections. And that means whether or not the Kurdish electorate is going to be as disciplined, and whether or not the coalition, particularly E-Party in that coalition, will continue to actually contain or restrain itself in terms of dealing indirectly or implicitly with the Kurdish electorate. And you see already that there is a lot of political investment in trying to break them away from the coalition, and there had been resignations from the party as well. So what I can say, and it may be a bit abstract, what we do have today is not tenable, and it really cannot continue ad infinitum. But we don't know when ad infinitum ends, or where we reach that point when it cannot continue. And you need to have a political momentum, and I particularly when it comes to foreign policy matters that are now becoming maybe even more important for Turkey's domestic political developments, the opposition is basically a wall.
Mm-hmm. So it looks like more crisis ahead for Turkey, which has been in crisis for 6-7 years now, right?
6-7 years, probably not, but I would say, okay, you're putting Gezi 2013,
right?
True, but probably in terms of what people care, that is the sanctity of the electoral system and stuff, since 2015, I would say. Mm-hmm. And also having been blindsided in the referendum, only a year after we moved to in earnest to the new presidential governmental system, 58 to 60% of the electorate wish to go back to the parliamentary system, which tells you not having a good public debate really hurts the prospects for a better functioning system. But that's a topic, I suppose, for a different conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time. Soli Özel,
Sure.
Kadir Has University. It's been a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.